Okay, is everyone about in the room and got a seat for themselves? Okay, well, welcome everybody to Dorset Humanists, our special Darwin Day celebration, albeit one day late, I'm afraid, but you'll forgive us because we always have our functions on the second Saturday of the month. A very warm welcome to Dorset Humanists, and I hope you've all had a good lunch, those of you that joined us at 12 o'clock, and welcome to the talk-only folk as well. I hope you've managed to pick up your cup of coffee. Darwin Day is celebrated all over the world as a global celebration of science and evolution. Charles Darwin was born 207 years ago yesterday. To advance our knowledge of science and evolution today, we're delighted to welcome Darren Naish, who is a paleontologist and science writer currently based at the University of Southampton. He has a particular interest in sauropods, which, as I'm sure you all know, means lizard-footed. Sauropods were dinosaurs with long necks and long tails. Darren's published several popular books on prehistoric animals, including the Dorling Kindersley Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs and Prehistoric Life, and the highly acclaimed BBC book Walking with Dinosaurs. And I believe Darren has brought a few of his publications along today if you're interested in purchasing and getting him to sign them for you. So I hope you've been doing your dinosaur homework. Today I believe he's going to try and convince us that we still live in the age of dinosaurs because the birds we see all around us are descended from the dinosaurs. So will you please give a very warm welcome to Darren Naish.
Walking into the podium. Hello, thank you very much for that introduction. My name is Darren Naish, based at the University of Southampton, and the title of this talk, Predatory Dinosaurs and the Evolution of Birds. And let's start with birds. I mean, birds, aren't they great? Everyone loves birds, and the great thing about birds is, unlike so many groups of animals, you can look out the window here. You can look out the window in your garden and see birds. You don't have to go to the Amazon or go to the zoo. So I love watching street pigeons. They're great. They do loads of crazy stuff. Gulls, crows, all these birds around us. We are familiar with birds. We have a lot of hands-on experience with birds, most of us, and of course many of us even eat birds or keep them as pets. One of the things that I want to get across to you today is that when you get to familiarise yourself with the anatomy of birds, you cannot ignore the fact that birds are dinosaurs. Birds aren't just descendants of dinosaurs or relatives of dinosaurs, they are dinosaurs. This is not controversial anymore. In fact, if we look in detail at the anatomy of living birds, we see numerous features that we've always classically regarded as kind of key dinosaur-like features. I mean, you look at the slides here. Look at the illustrations here. The hand at the top left is an ostrich hand. You're looking at it from the palm side. In the image underneath it, you're looking at it from the outside surface of the hand. And you'll notice that you can see three distinct fingers with claws. And this isn't because it's an ostrich and it's a particularly weird bird. This is actually not uncommon in birds. Separate clawed fingers are quite common in birds. And I don't think many people realise that. You know, every time you're looking at a bird wing, look at the bird's hand, you're looking at a dinosaur hand. Of course, some of you will know that some birds are especially famous for having clawed hands. You can see there, that is the clawed hand of a juvenile of a South American land bird, an animal called the hoatzin or hoatzin, written hoatzin. And this animal is famous because the chicks have these large hand claws, but that is not a special thing. In fact, birds of many sorts have evolved spurs and spines and club-like structures on their hands that they use in combat. This illustration here, if you can see that that's a duck skeleton filled with blue material, what's happened there is somebody has filled in the air sac system with blue latex. Birds have a system that's very alien to us. Their lungs are not just bags on the ends of straws, which is basically how our lungs work. They instead have this air sac system, this series of large sacs distributed throughout the body. And the point is, this is not a unique bird thing. This is present throughout lots of dinosaur groups, lots of non-bird dinosaur groups. Now, in recent years, what with our constant advances, as goes the link between genetics and the expression of anatomy, what we call evo-devo, this whole link between evolution, developmental genetics, we are learning that if you tinker with the genomes of birds, you can get modern birds to grow structures that are more typical of those we associate with non-bird dinosaurs. This slide illustrates one of these evo-devo experiments. This was published, I believe, last year by Bart Anjar-Buller and colleagues. They took some chicken embryos. Now, in modern birds, the bones that form much of the upper jaw, most of the bill, or beak, whichever term you prefer, most of the bones there are formed, well, most of the anatomy there is formed by two fused bones. They called the premaxillary, formed of actually two bones that fuse together. Now, if you look at the condition in non-bird dinosaurs, they don't have this large fused premaxillary bone. Instead, they've got two distinct unfused premaxillary bones. We're looking there at the snout of a non-bird dinosaur from the Jurassic. So the modern bird condition is somewhat different from the non-bird dinosaur one. But tinkering with the genetics of these animals, we can get chicken embryos to switch off the growth of this large fused single premaxillary bone, and instead we can grow chickens with dinosaur faces. So that's exactly what they did. It didn't mean that they created little mutant chickens that then had to be euthanized. They did this with little embryos. But there's a normal chicken, big fused premaxillary bone. This is an alligator. Now, an alligator has got the dinosaur-like condition of two separate premaxillary bones, and here is a genetically modified chicken with a dinosaur face. So you can see it's got these paired premaxillary bones. Now, if you did this with enough of the features, enough of the bits of anatomy in a bird embryo, you could get a bird to grow a long tail. Might be a feathery tail, not a scaly tail, but you could get a bird to grow a long tail. You could get it with obvious separate clawed fingers. You could get it to have like a toothy mouth and a dinosaur-like head. And I mean, I'm a big fan of chickens. I'm not sure that I approve of this, but people are doing this. They are planning to create dino chicken kind of creatures. An American paleontologist in particular called Jack Horner is big on this idea. Now, of course, when you hear the term dinosaur, you probably think of images like this. These are the dinosaurs that many of us, I'm a child of the 1970s, these are the images of dinosaurs that were certainly typical for me as a child, and I'm sure that's the case for many of you here. But if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk today, is that these images are not at all accurate. They're not at all consistent with our understanding of what dinosaurs were really like, despite the fact that this is from a film that came out in 1992 or 1993, the Jurassic Park movie. You should think of these creatures as kind of like hypothetical constructs based on an incomplete amount of knowledge. Many of you will know that, for example, the ancient Greeks and Romans found the bones of ancient animals, and they interpreted them the best they could as the remains of kind of giants or heroes or mythical creatures. And you should think of these images of dinosaurs as kind of similar to that. This isn't the full picture. Tyrannosaurus rex did not look like this. It did not walk around kind of with its belly on display, its legs splayed to the side. It didn't have a head shaped like a brick. It didn't drag its tail on the ground. These are kind of like half-complete images of what these creatures really look like. And what kind of bothers me, I try not to get too angry about it, is that this ye olde view of the scaly, fat, tail-dragging lizard-like dinosaur, this is an image that will not die. I mean, people love this idea. So when we have films today that depict dinosaurs, the Jurassic Park and the Jurassic World franchise, they stick with this. They still go with this idea of like big, fat, swamp-dwelling, wrinkly-skinned, ugly, fat dinosaurs. Some of you will have seen a film from last year called Jurassic World, which is the kind of reincarnation, the reboot of the Jurassic Park franchise. And myself and many other paleontologists, we were really hoping that this film would give us a reboot, that it would give us a modern, exciting, dynamic, colourful view of the dinosaur world. That it would present a view that's consistent with our current scientific understanding of non-bird dinosaurs. But of course it didn't. It stuck with this kind of like old, fat, grey, wrinkly, scaly, no feathers, the director said right from the start before the film came out, no feathers. And I've gone online, well, I'm on record as having said that Jurassic World is simply a dumb monster movie, and there has been a deliberate effort to make its animals look different from the way we think they should. I know it's only a film, I know, and I don't care about it that much, but if you're going to ask an expert about it today, what do you think of Jurassic World? It's like, well, it was a pretty terrible film, but even if it wasn't a terrible film, it's still a tremendous shame that they chose to stick with this old, you know, this old, consistent, scaly-skinned view of dinosaurs when they really could have given us something different. And don't tell me that that's because they needed to stick with consistency and it had to be in universe and they had to be done in keeping with the canon, because they could easily have changed it. They could have said, well, it turns out Velociraptor didn't look like this big bipedal Komodo dragon monster. Instead, it was resplendently decked out in purple feathers and it looked like a giant pheasant and it was cuddly. They could have done that. When you think of dinosaurs, you should be thinking of images like this. Now, these are all done by brilliant paleo artists, people who specialise in the reconstruction of prehistoric life, but they didn't just make this stuff up. They didn't just imbibe narcotic things and dream this. This is all based on actual hard evidence. We now know, with no doubt, that non-bird dinosaurs really look like this. This animal at the top right there, that's Velociraptor. Velociraptor doesn't look like a bipedal Komodo scaly-skinned dragon thing. It's a kind of like giant fuzzy land hawk. We even know what colour some of these animals were now. I'll come back to that point later on. All the animals I'm going to be talking about in this talk are theropods. This is the group of dinosaurs, the so-called predatory dinosaurs, that includes birds. And if we look at the basic anatomy of theropod dinosaurs, as you can see from the skeletal reconstruction at the top, all of them are pretty much built along the kind of general pattern that we recognise as typical for birds. They typically have functionally three-toed feet. Now, technically they have 4 toes, but the first toe, the one equivalent to your big toe, is probably called the hallux. This is raised, it tends not to contact the ground, and they walk on these 3 toes. This basically is a bird-like foot. I've been a bit silly here in using a particularly unusual kind of theropod called a dromaeosaurid, which has a large raised second toe, this big sickle-clawed that doesn't come into contact with the ground. But typically they're 3-toed. They've got a fairly short, compact body. They start out with a long tail, but the tail is reduced over time. They've got like a fairly muscular, flexible, S-shaped neck. And although pictures tend to show them with the arms and hands facing forwards, at least some of them could kind of fold the arms, fold the forelimbs up somewhat. The wrists in some of these animals are very flexible. And when you're looking at a bird wing, and this is particularly handy, the fact that there are breeds of featherless chickens, the hand is folded up against the side of the radius and ulna in a manner that we can't practice without breaking arc joints. The flexible wrist allows the hand to be folded up against the lower arm. So, hey, they really are featherless, bird-like dinosaurs, but that's certainly not typical. The majority of them, we now know, were fully feathered. Theropods span this enormous range in body sizes. Birds are theropods, so the smallest theropods are things like the Cuban bee hummingbird. What is that, 1.95 grams, 60 millimetres long, so not that different from the size of your thumb. At the other end of the scale, we know of giant behemoths, beasts like Spinosaurus from North Africa. Those of you who know anything about dinosaurs will know that this reconstruction by Davide Bonadonna depicts the animal as an amphibious, mostly aquatic predator. There is some controversy as to whether that's accurate or not. It does seem that Spinosaurus spent at least some time in the water. And Spinosaurus is probably even larger than the famous giant theropod and the most famous non-bird dinosaur of all them all, Tyrannosaurus rex. This is FMNHPR2081, the famous individual generally known as Sue, currently on display at the Field Museum in Chicago and the subject of a very interesting legal battle. Eventually being purchased by, was it by McDonald's for $8 million, something like that. Anyway, fantastic specimen on display. Tyrannosaurus rex and Spinosaurus, they are something like 10 tons or maybe more, and 15, 16, 17, 18 metres maybe. Tyrannosaurus maybe 12 metres, Spinosaurus maybe 15 metres, maybe 18 metres. These animals are giants, clearly. This is a family tree diagram of all dinosaurs don't worry about the details. The only reason this is here is to show you that theropods are not an irrelevant small subgroup of dinosaurs. Theropods are like about a third of all dinosaur diversity. Well, hold on. They're about a third of all of non-bird dinosaur diversity, because what this diagram doesn't show you the full diversity of birds. So on this particular family tree diagram, birds are like one little group down there, because this tree only shows the birds of the so-called age of dinosaurs, of the Mesozoic era. But of course, birds, the only dinosaur group that survived the end Cretaceous extinction event 66 million years ago, there's then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lineages of birds that evolved after the end Cretaceous extinction event. So if this tree really did show the full diversity of post-Cretaceous birds, you'd have, you know, the cladogram substantially bigger than what's shown on the screen, because we've got about 10,000 living bird species, and people estimate that over the past 66 or so million years there have maybe been about 1 million bird species in total. So this means that most dinosaurs are birds. Birds are the most successful, most specious group of dinosaurs of them all, and because birds are theropods, it also means that theropods, this group we call the predatory dinosaurs, they are the most successful and long-lived of dinosaur groups as well. Here's a really simple family tree showing some of the main divisions within Theropoda, within theropods, and what I want you to basically note is there's a bunch of early groups that we kind of call basal theropods or primitive theropods. Those of you know dinosaurs, animals like Ararosaurus, Coelophysis and Dilophosaurus go here. Then we've got a large group of so-called stiff-tailed theropods, the tetanurans, and this is the group that includes megalosaurs, allosaurs, spinosaurs, all those familiar big predatory dinosaurs, and the coelurosaurs. And the coelurosaurs are the birds and the bird-like dinosaurs, but tyrannosaurs are part of this group as well, especially bird-like ones. That group actually includes tyrannosaurs. So that's a basic framework. I would suggest you remember, there's basal theropods, then there's allosaurs, spinosaurs, megalosaurs, then there's coelurosaurs. That's kind of what you might need to remember in the rest of this discussion. If we look at the anatomical features that we see appearing in along the history of theropods, we see key features that that today are unique to birds. We see them evolving at different points in theropod history. So I introduced to you early on the fact that theropods have got this three-toed bird-like foot. Nothing else today has a foot like a bird. You can recognise it instantly. But that kind of foot is not unique to birds. It characterises all of theropods. It evolved right at the start of theropod history. I told you that a lot of theropods can fold up their arms, and obviously birds have taken this to an extreme, folding up the wing. The features associated with forelimb folding are again not unique to birds. They evolved round about here at the base of this major group called Tetanuri. And this diagram here also shows the wishbone, that familiar V-shaped bone. That shows that appearing at the base of Tetanuri as well. So the wishbone, a key bird feature, again nothing else has it today, but it's not unique to birds. It evolved much, much earlier in theropods. This is now out of date, because in fact we now know that the wishbone, probably called the furcula, it actually is known from the earliest of theropods. It evolved right at the base of Theropoda. Why? No idea. Don't know. Don't know why the furcula evolved in the first place. But the fact that it evolves in predatory, terrestrial, mid-sized predatory dinosaurs means that whatever the context of its origin was, it was nothing to do with flight. It wasn't to do with, in birds people have suggested that it's got some kind of elastic potential and it returns energy to the chest bones during the downstroke. No, that's not why it evolved in the first place. If we now look, there's a different family tree. This one just shows the coelurosaurs. That's that bird-like group that includes birds. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want you to note that all of these little diagrams on the left show key bird-like features to do with the shape of the rib cage, the length of the tail, the anatomy and complexity of the feathers, the length of the forelimbs. All of those structures evolved way before birds did. Feathers evolved before birds did. Elongate forelimbs evolved way before birds did. Enlarged breastbones evolved way before birds did in other groups of theropods. So what we're learning is that, basically everything in evolution is a big mess. There's all these different things happening at different times in different groups. Things don't just fall magically into place when you end up with your modern group of animals. We're seeing many different lineages of theropods, non-bird theropods, experimenting with different bits of anatomy that today we only see in birds, because birds are the only surviving lineage of this whole group. Now, there is a general trend across the whole history of theropod evolution, and that concerns body size. This graph shows time on the y-axis, and these little silhouettes positioned against this big family tree diagram. You'll notice that they show the animals at some of the key divergence points in evolutionary history becoming smaller over time. This isn't to say that all theropods were all becoming smaller all the time. That's certainly not the case. Members of many lineages were evolving giant size at different times. But if you look at the main backbone of the tree, the key, what we call the concestors, the animals at different nodes along the cladogram, they're getting smaller and smaller over time. There's like this long-term pervasive trend existing for over 50 million years. Theropods are becoming smaller. So it's almost as if the evolution of birds was kind of inevitability. It's like theropods were getting smaller, they were already feathery, they already had bird-like feet, they already were shortening their tails, they were becoming smaller and smaller over time. Here's another slide demonstrating this with a few more images that make exactly the same point. This is research that myself and a team of others published a couple of years ago. There is this trend towards larger size across the whole of theropod history. Now let's look at a couple of the different groups that I've mentioned, and let's start with those big predators I mentioned. I mentioned that there's this group, this part of the cladogram where you see megalosaurs. You will know, of course, about Megalosaurus, discovered at Stonesfield in Oxfordshire, first discovered in the late 1700s, but then not really kind of understood. Nobody really knew what to do about it until the 1820s, when William Buckland decided to publish it as a new animal, Megalosaurus, the giant lizard. He thought it was kind of like a giant monitor lizard. He was spurred into publishing this paper on Megalosaurus because he knew that Gideon Mantell in Sussex was just about to publish on Iguanodon. So that's why Megalosaurus discovered in the late 1700s, but then actually they finally pulled their finger out and published it 1824, I think that's right. And that is a reconstruction of Megalosaurus. So a famous English dinosaur, one of the very first, well, the first non-bird dinosaur to be named. And Megalosaurus is part of a major group that also includes the spinosaurs. Obviously you could give a whole lecture about spinosaurs. There is endless amounts of stuff to say about them. This amazing group of long-skulled, kind of crocodile-snouted big theropods, including the biggest theropods of all, giant tall sail on the back. Recent studies suggesting from their limb proportions and bone anatomy that maybe they looked really stupid. Maybe they had like really short hind limbs and a dinky little pelvis. Maybe they were strongly adapted for aquatic life, but that is controversial. People contest that. They say that this reconstruction is based on several different individuals, maybe of different species. So yeah, Spinosaurs, important group, best known from the Sahara, really. But for a long time we knew of these dinosaurs, Spinosaurs, from bits and pieces. It was actually a specimen found in a clay pit in Surrey that was the Rosetta Stone, an animal called Baryonyx walkeri, discovered by an amateur fossil finder, a plumber, William Walker, who discovered Baryonyx, and it was, wow, that shows what Spinosaurs were like. Now we know they look like these things. Megalosaurs, Spinosaurs, and then allosaurs. Allosaurs, this group of deep-skulled, Jurassic and Cretaceous large-bodied predatory theropods. And this is a particularly unusual allosaur from Spain called Concavanator. It's got this weird kind of sail thing over its back. Having just mentioned sails in Spinosaurus, you'll know that this is a familiar theme in the history of dinosaurs. The evolution of crests and sails and frills and plates and things. There's a tendency among paleontologists for them to seek, I don't know what the right term is for this. There's a tendency to try and seek a kind of mechanical explanation for these structures. Oh, it was something to do with temperature regulation, or it's something to do with muscles were attached to it to give them more leverage, or that kind of stuff. But I'm part of a group of researchers that argues that a lot of these structures are visual display structures. They're probably mostly used in sexual and social display. And of course that's consistent with what we understand about non-bird dinosaurs' living relatives. I mean, living birds are all crazy showy creatures that often look ridiculous with combs, wattles and giant tail feathers, and I think this was the case for non-bird dinosaurs as well. Showy creatures. Now, this is a small non-bird theropod from the Jurassic of Germany called Sciuromymus, named in 2012, and I think it's about 50 centimetres long. And spectacular complete skeleton, as you can see. People have studied this animal under UV light, which has revealed a whole wealth of anatomical details not visible to the naked eye. And it's called Sciuromymus. The name means squirrel mimic, because this animal is covered in fuzz. You may not be able to see poor quality projection images, but there are these kind of fine filaments distributed all along the length of the back, along the side of the body, and apparently covering the tail, kind of like a thick bush. So that's why they called it Sciuromymus, squirrel mimic, because they imagined it had a bushy squirrel-like tail. That life reconstruction there, I don't know if you can make that out, but that's reconstruction by an excellent paleo artist called Emily Willoughby, and she has depicted this animal in accurate fuzzy fashion. So a fuzzy little theropod. But what makes Sciuromymus especially interesting with regard to what I've just been telling you about giant theropods like megalosaurs, spinosaurs and allosaurs is that, here's that cladogram again, Sciuromymus was originally published as a spinosaur. So the team of researchers naming it, they said this tiny little theropod is actually a tiny member of the spinosaur family, closely related to the giant sailback Spinosaurus. Now, whoa, really? Because what does this mean? When you look at a family tree like this, you should employ what we call tree-based thinking. If we know that a structure is present in, say, this animal here, and it's present in, say, this animal here, well, we infer that it would have actually originated in evolutionary history round about that point there, so all members of this clade, this group, would have it. So if we really do have a fuzzy little spinosaur, Coelurosaurs, the group that includes birds, we know they've got feathers and fuzz and other associated integumentary structures, then we should infer that fuzz was present in all of these animals. So does Sciuromymus show that spinosaurs and megalosaurs and allosaurs and Coelurosaurs, does it show they were all fuzzy, or did they all start out their evolutionary history with fuzz? Maybe it's just that the small ones were fuzzy, and as they became bigger, they lost it. They became less fuzzy or scaly skinned. Well, they kind of, you know, the correct answer is we don't know. We don't really know whether that's the case or not. We just don't have enough information. We have no skin for the vast majority of these animals. You know, Sciuromymus is a one-off. And as appealing as this idea is, the idea of a Spinosaurian Sciuromymus that might show that there was fuzz in Spinosaurus and so on, there is the possibility that we've got its position on the cladogram wrong. That does happen quite a lot. And this is what it would mean for the distribution of filament-like structures. It would mean that, well, we've got filament-like structures in a spinosaur. It would mean that filament-like structures originated here, in which case they would be inherited by megalosaurs, spinosaurs, allosaurs, and Coelurosaurs. But this is contingent on that position for Sciuromymus being correct, and it may not be. Sciuromymus may actually be a Coelurosaur. However, details. If you are at all familiar with the history of how dinosaurs have been depicted in artwork, and particularly in the artwork that's appeared in the technical literature, you'll know that in fact artists have been reconstructing theropods with fuzz for decades now. At the top is an illustration from a really famous Scientific American article published in 1975 by a guy called Robert Bakker, who's one of the kind of famous iconoclastic sort of pioneers of the way we think about dinosaurs at the moment. And he had this illustration done. It shows an early Jurassic South African dinosaur called Syntarsus, and he's illustrated it as fully feathered. He hasn't just given it a head crest, which is what many people seem to have assumed. There's many other artists have copied this and they just copied the head crest. But he's actually shown the whole animal as fuzzy. And this is his depiction of a bird-like theropod called Deinonychus, which he published in 1986. This is the animal called Velociraptor in Jurassic Park. The thing called in Jurassic Park called Velociraptor isn't really Velociraptor, it's this animal, Deinonychus, and he's covered it in feathers. And here's a reconstruction from the early 80s by an artist called Mark Hallett. He's shown an Australian theropod called Kukuru resting on the ground, and it's completely fuzzy. It will be furry to the touch. So artists are showing fuzzy theropods as far back as the mid-70s. How was this received by technical paleontologists? Well, for a long time, the majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them were saying this was speculative rubbish. Basically stuff just invented by artists. They're just artists, they can do what they like, nobody cares. They're probably not right, because dinosaurs are scaly skinned. All dinosaurs are scaly skinned. That was the main thinking, certainly that I grew up with. You kept on seeing this again in the 80s and up into the early 1990s. You had paleontologists saying no, these feathered renditions, they're just done by artists, and artists that we all know are crazy and flamboyant. Until, when was it? I think it was 1996. This animal was published from Liaoning province in northeastern China, and it has the name Sinosauropteryx prima. It's a small, long-tailed theropod. It's now known from quite a few specimens, and you'll notice that without doubt this animal is fuzzy. It's got fur-like structures, well, hair-like structures all over the place. You can see hopefully this kind of dark halo of fuzz. This is along the back of the animal's neck. This image is flipped relative to the look at the fossil there. Here's a close-up of these structures. These are really similar to the fuzzy integument, the fuzzy feathers that you get on, like kiwis and emus, birds like that. So here is definitive evidence, published in 1996, that at least some of these small non-bird theropods really were fuzzy. Not just with a little tiny bit of fuzz on the back of the neck or something, but they're covered in it. Sinosauropteryx is covered in this stuff. It's on the sides of the face, sides of the body, on the limbs as well. And since then, since 1996, Liaoning province in China has yielded, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's a large number of species. I would guess it's something like going on for between 30 and 40 species of non-bird theropods that have filaments and fuzz preserved on them, around their bodies, and the number of individuals, we are talking about hundreds of individuals. We're not talking about one or two that might have been knocked up in a fossil shop, we're talking about hundreds of specimens. And they range from species that do have fuzzy structures, as I just showed you for Sinosauropteryx, to animals that have large, complex wing-like structures formed of true, complex, veined feathers. Just a small selection here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but most famous one, Microraptor. This is a small relative of Velociraptor, but can you see these long, complex, veined feathers growing off its forelimbs? There's an upper forelimb there, and strangely, it also has long, complex feathers growing off its hind limbs as well. Talk about that more in a minute if I have time. So there's no doubt, thanks to these hundreds of fossils, no doubt, small bird-like, non-bird theropods, fully fuzzy or fully feathery. And I said that we now have some idea as to what colour they were. For years, if you asked a paleontologist what colour a non-bird dinosaur was, my favourite answer was, it's the least important thing. Really is the least important thing. Stop asking about it. It's like, we don't know. We just go with whatever looks right. If you're doing a picture, you colour the dinosaur whatever looks right based on modern analogues and the environment it's in. But now we actually have some hard science behind this. It turns out that these fuzzy and feathery theropods have preserved on their feathers and filaments structures called melanosomes. These are kind of like little packages of pigments. And different shapes of melanosomes match to different pigments. So there's three main kinds. There are the structures called eumelanosomes. I'm hoping I remember this correctly because I haven't revised this. There are structures called eumelanosomes which are, I think, rounded and are associated with reds and browns. And we see those in some of these dinosaurs like Sinosauropteryx. In fact, along the tail, Sinosauropteryx has evidence of banding, of red bands and bands of another colour. It's always depicted as white, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were white in life. That's kind of the default colour. We don't really know what the actual colour was. Then there are phaeomelanosomes that are associated with, I think, oranges and yellows. They're seen in some of these animals. And then there are, no, is phaeomelanosomes, is that greys and blacks? I really should have checked this beforehand. We know that some of these animals had large patches of grey and black on the body, the tail, various parts of the wings. This is another one called Anchiornis. This is not a bird, this is a near bird or bird-like non-bird, probably. And we even have melanosomes in some of these animals that are the kind of melanosomes linked with iridescence. So we think that some of these feathery non-bird theropods were actually iridescent. This is the case for Microraptor. This is an illustration by an artist called Jason Broom. It always reminds me of kind of New Caledonian crows or something, but this is his reconstruction of Microraptor as an iridescent tree-dwelling small non-bird dinosaur. We have melanosomes demonstrating this. Interestingly, Microraptor was suggested for a time to be a nocturnal dinosaur because its eyes are so big. But do you ever see iridescent feathers in nocturnal animals? No, you don't. So the iridescence seems to refute that. Iridescence demonstrates that it was actually diurnal, day-active dinosaur. Now, what does this information about feathers and coloration, what does it actually mean for the life appearance of these animals? Well, I think a lot of artists actually struggle with this. And some artists, while they've adopted this with open arms and done a really good job of depicting feathery dinosaurs accurately, others have not. And for a start, you've got people who illustrated non-bird dinosaurs as scaly. For example, this image of Deinonychus here, top left, done by an artist called Stefan Cherkas. When he found out that it was feathered, he went and slapped a load of feathers on his Deinonychus model, and I don't know about you, but that just doesn't convince me as a real animal. It's got a kind of Muppetish quality to it. Now, a guy called Greg Paul, he's one of the kind of great pioneers of the modern look of non-bird dinosaurs. He has always done feathers on his theropods, but the thing is, would you really know it? He's put so little feathering on them, they're so sparse, the feathering, that you almost can't see it. He's just done this tiny little veneer and he's done a little fringe of feathers along the arms. No, that's not what the fossils show. The fossils show these animals looking ridiculous, like grouse or pheasants or chickens or hawks. They really should be thickly decked out in feathers. And then of course we've got people who just don't really know what they're doing. I mean, there's some computer generated things. These are pretty criminal, meant to be feathery dinosaurs. Then we also have the possibility that maybe feathered dinosaurs looked absolutely ridiculous. This is an image by a guy called Lewis Ray, who kind of likes the idea that feathery dinosaurs were resplendent and multicoloured and kind of like a cross between a turkey and a raccoon on acid. That's, it's probably more right than some of the other images we're seeing here. When you look at a bird wing, why don't you see the hand with those clawed fingers? Well, the answer is, as revealed by this magpie wing up here, the fingers here actually support the feathers. In feathery theropods, including birds of course, the feathers grow from the second finger. The second finger is one of the main supports of the feathers. The primaries grow off the second finger and off the associated metacarpal, this bone in the palm of the hand. This is the case for these feathery dinosaurs as well. We always see, this is the hand of a recently described non-bird feathery dinosaur, the feathers are growing off the second finger. This is the reconstruction of the hand of Archaeopteryx. You can see the feathers growing off the second finger. So many reconstructions, even today, you'll see the fingers of these feathered dinosaurs shown as if they're kind of a separate thing. People often show the hands as this like scaly thing, but then they still put feathers here. It's like, no, the hand is the wing, is the same thing. The feathers grow off the second finger. You can't have 3 fingers and a wing, the same structure. So remember that. I mean, there are people still getting it wrong, but there's an increasing number of people who are now getting it right. There's actually a t-shirt design you can buy, plug. It's got, I don't know if you can see it well enough, but it's got your Jurassic Park, Jurassic World style Deinonychus, and then your sparsely feathered one. No, this is not correct. Whereas yes, these things look like kind of ancient land hawks or pheasant-y type things. So I think I'm repeating myself if I talk about Scuromymus a bit more. If Scuromymus is a spinosaur type animal, a megalosaur type animal, it would mean that you've got fuzz at least, not necessarily complex feathers, but fuzz at least in spinosaurs, megalosaurs and allosaurs. So let's keep this in mind. Do we have fuzz in these animals? Well, allosaurs, I've already said, these familiar, deep-skulled, large predators. The best known of them is Allosaurus from the famous Morrison Formation, the continental western interior of the United States. That's Allosaurus there, attacking a stegosaur. It's not the only one, of course. There's a whole bunch of them from China, like this one, Yangshuanosaurus. Notice the enormous size of some of the air-filled cavities in the skulls of these animals. The orbit, the eye socket, is this one here, this long, slim one. The eyeball itself would sit in the top of this long cavity. This giant cavity here, the antorbital fenestra, is been a long debate as to what it's, if it has a function and what structures occupied it. It now seems that a giant air-filled sac sat in that space, although quite why that was there we still don't know. Something to do with making louder noises, something to do with lightening the head, we don't know. So a load of Chinese allosaurs and a load of giant South American ones. This is Giganotosaurus from Argentina. This animal is almost on par with Tyrannosaurus, a giant allosaur from the Cretaceous. You'll notice that a lot of these big predatory dinosaurs have got short, very muscular, heavily built three-fingered hands with enormous claws that are shaped like the talons on eagles' feet. And how these animals actually behaved is still something that we're not completely sure about. How did they actually attack and kill things? Some people have imagined that giant theropods like Allosaurus ran up to big things like sauropods and kind of took slashing bites from them. And their skulls do seem to be well designed for resisting stress, for taking a lot of, resisting a lot of impact. But their forelimbs do seem to have, they seem to have evolved under kind of selection pressure to do with grabbing and restraining things. A thing that's typical for theropods is their palms face inwards. This is the normal hand pose. So reconstructions that show them like this, we call this the bunny hands pose or the zombie pose. This is not correct. You have to break the wrist and the elbow to get the hands to be in that pose. Their hands naturally are palms inwards, which is good for grabbing things. If you're a big predator going around grabbing smaller things, you want to have this palms inwards thing. And as you can see, you've got an Allosaurus here with its hands preserved in that fashion. The claws, as I've said, similar to those eagle talons. They're similar to eagle talons in terms of curvature and cross-sectional shape. So they're probably good at piercing tissue. But the fingers of these dinosaurs, of allosaurs, are also particularly flexible in terms of how much extension and flexion they can withstand. Flexion is anything to do with bringing things into the body. Extension is anything to do with moving stuff out from the body. So these fingers of these allosaurs are really flexible. They can hyperextend, hyperflex, which again is kind of what we would expect if these animals are grabbing things which presumably don't want to be eaten and then restraining them while then biting. I think this is actually how they predated. They grabbed things with the hands. So they weren't necessarily going for, like, let's say Allosaurus, length of 8 meters. It's not necessarily attacking Stegosaurus every week. It's probably mostly attacking human-sized animals, grabbing them, biting them, able to resist them with these flexible fingers and strong forelimbs. Here's where we come back to the story of filaments and feathers, because if you remember the position in the cladogram for Scuromymus, I'm saying if that's a spinosaur, does it mean we've got filaments and fuzz and such in spinosaurs, allosaurs and megalosaurs? Well, this is Concavinator, again, published a few years ago, and one of the forelimb bones of Concavinator has got this line of bumps. And these are very similar to the quill nodes or quill knobs that you see on the ulna, this lower arm bone, of birds. So it has actually been proposed that here in Concavinator, it's from Spain, here you see evidence for the attachment points of feathers or filaments or structures that are of evolutionarily the same origin as feathers and filaments. I'm not completely sure this is convincing, because there are other fossil animals where we see lines of little bumps like this and they're nothing to do with filaments or feathers. They're sometimes to do with the anatomy of what we call the intermuscular line, this kind of like bridge in between the muscles. You see this on the, it's seen in this is an English predatory dinosaur, and it's shin bone. It's got nothing to do with filaments or feathers. So I'm not completely convinced by this, but it's very suggestive. It's possible, it's plausible that concavenator, or maybe other allosaurs, had quills or filaments or something along their arms. We're arguing about this at the moment. We're arguing as to whether this is valid or not. Here's that coelurosaur tree again. I do not have time to obviously go through all the coelurosaurs. There are lots of lineages of them. But one of the most famous groups, the Tyrannosaurs, Tyrannosauroids, or tyrant dinosaurs. You will of course know about the giant latest Cretaceous kinds like Tyrannosaurus rex. Tyrannosaurus rex is not depicted on this slide. This shows other animals. Daspletosaurus, Gorgosaurus, and this is Eotyrannus from the Isle of Wight in England. This is the animal I did my PhD on. A lot of blood, sweat and tears. Still working on that thing. So we have English Tyrannosaurs. And as you can see, the early members of the group, they're not as big as the classic giant ones like your Tyrannosaurus rexes and so on. They've got long, three-fingered, even four-fingered hands. They do not have proportionally gigantic skulls, but they do have a couple of features of the skull that are associated with what we call power biting. They probably are using an incredibly powerful bite to damage the prey they're biting into, but they're also starting off by grabbing them with their hands. Now again, this is a group where we have filamentous structures present on the bodies and tails and necks and faces of these animals. This is a Chinese one called Dilong paradoxus. It's not very big, it's about 1.2 metres in total length, life reconstruction there. It's going to be a small, a predator of small animals, little dinosaurs, lizardy things, small mammals. And you'll notice in these photographs, these are the tail bones here. You see all this dark staining stuff, these filaments. These are filaments that are preserved all over the place in these animals. So small, fuzzy tyrannosaurs. But it's not just small tyrannosaurs that were fuzzy. Here are some images depicting Eutyrannus. Again, this is from China. It's known from several specimens, all of which were preserved together, something indicating some kind of social behaviour in these particular dinosaurs. And this is a big early tyrannosaur. This is an animal about 9 metres long. I hope you can see the beautiful skull here. The orbit is around about there. The nostril is around about there. There's the line of the mouth there with the big teeth. And see these kind of like scores or striations present all over the animal, all over the side of the back and the neck and tail of giant fuzzy tyrannosaur. Now when this animal is alive, the place in which it lives, Liaoning province, northeastern China, is cool. Not cold as in like Iceland cold, but it's got an average annual temperature of about 10 degrees C, which is similar to here, similar to say New York State, that kind of thing. These dinosaurs were not living in a permanent tropical hothouse. Some of them were living in cool places. During the colder part of the year, it might have been cold enough for a little bit of frost, a little bit of snow and ice, that kind of thing. So maybe that explains why some of these predatory dinosaurs are so decked out in fuzz and feathers. Maybe some of them are cold adapted. But you're asking, you're thinking, what does this mean for the famous giant tyrannosaurs? What does it mean for Tyrannosaurus rex? Does this mean I have to imagine Tyrannosaurus rex as fuzzy or feathery? Well, probably yes. There are still quite a few experts who argue against this. They say no, we should stick with a scaly skin giant tyrannosaurs for now. What evidence do we have? Well, we've got this patch of skin from a Tyrannosaurus. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. They're saying, haha, scaly skin on Tyrannosaurus rex. Yeah, but if Tyrannosaurus rex is, say, that size, so like more than 10 metres long, if you find a patch of skin this size, this may not be a reliable indication as to the look of the entire animal. You can probably find patches of naked skin on your own body. It doesn't mean that you're naked everywhere, because obviously you're not. Based on the other tyrannosauroids we have, with filamentous structures, we should imagine even these giant tyrannosauroids, like Tyrannosaurus rex, probably as fuzzy. And how fuzzy we make them is at the moment kind of is down to artistic whimsy. I mean, obviously we've got some reconstructions here that do show the animals as fully pelted, Maybe they had naked faces and didn't have fuzz everywhere. Maybe they didn't have it on the belly or the limbs. Maybe they only had it on the upper surface, the back. Those are all possibilities at the moment. Possibilities that we can't say any more about until we have far more extensive skin impressions from these animals. As always, the problem with paleontological evidence is you only ever have, well, you never have as much as you want. You only ever have bits. Like, I'm sure you've heard about this thing where, you know, you don't even have you've got the jigsaw, but you've only got a few pieces in the box, and you don't have a picture on the box, so good luck making the jigsaw. Closely related to Tyrannosaurs, another group of Coelurosaurian theropods, the ostrich dinosaurs, named for obvious reasons, because they look ostrichy. And the thing that the books always said when I was a kid is ostrich dinosaurs, one of the dinosaurs, they're really similar to ostriches, but don't forget, they wouldn't really be like ostriches because, of course, they were scaly skinned. They did not have feathers. So you have all these classic reconstructions of, this is a classic trope, a meme in all dinosaur books from the 1980s and early 90s. You show your ostrich and you show your ostrich dinosaur running next to it, but make sure you show your ostrich dinosaur scaly skinned, because it's a non-bird dinosaur, got to be scaly skinned, right? Wrong. Not only would we predict that they were fuzzy based on their position in the cladogram, the distribution of fuzzy structures around them in the evolutionary history, but we now have fossils of these animals that are fully decked out in fuzz. Again, I appreciate it might be hard to see all the details of these particular photographs, but we have specimens from Canada. The bones are kind of at the bottom part of these images, and then all this kind of smeary mess. This is formed of long filaments, showing that these dinosaurs are fully decked out in long, filament-like integumentary structures, making them look rather similar to, say, ostriches, kiwis, emus and such. On the forearm bones, the radius and ulna, these dinosaurs have weird, dark, long striations attached to the bone, which seem to show they have long filaments or complex feathers growing off the forearms. And in fact, some people think they had a true wing, a kind of, can you see in this illustration here? Some people think they had proper, like, big wings. So they actually really were ostrich-like. They just look different from ostriches, I guess, because they've got like a long bony tail. A modern ostrich has got a very short tail. One of the weird features of modern birds being their tails are so short relative to those of non-bird dinosaurs. This is another specimen published last year, and again it's another ostrich dinosaur fully covered in fuzz. It's a whole skeleton, you can hopefully see it there. This blue shows the kind of shape and extent of the fuzz over the base of the tail. And it's not the base of the tail that's the only place that's got it, fully fuzzy. So, looking at everything we've kind of, looked at so far, what does this mean for the distribution of these structures on the skin of these non-bird dinosaurs? Well, it basically means that in Coelurosaurs, this group of theropods that includes birds, and the most bird-like groups also includes tyrannosaurs and ostrich dinosaurs, we see fuzz everywhere. Every single group has got fuzz, denoted by this this kind of symbol there. Complex feathers possibly present in ostrich dinosaurs, if those structures on the forearm are anything to do with them having a wing-like structure, maybe kind of a wing-like structure evolving early on as well. And then once we get to the more bird-like groups, more complex feathers, more wing-like structures. Wing-like structures are the norm. This is in groups that are not closely related to birds. Birds are down here, the youngest group in the family tree, but all these other groups, non-bird Coelurosaurian theropods, they've already got complex feathers and even wings. Now, this pattern of evolution that we see in these dinosaurs, the fact that we have filaments first, then we have branching structures, then we have more complex feathers, then we have true vein feathers forming wings, this does match some models of the evolution of feathers. In particular, one published by Crum and Brush a few years ago. They like the fact that their model matches the evolutionary history we see. Whether this is really how feathers evolved in the first place is still a subject of some controversy, as some of you will know. Now, a lot of these really bird-like Coelurosaurs belong to a particular group of Coelurosaurs called Maniraptorans. This means hand stealers or hand grabbers. And this is the group that's got the particularly long fingers, the particularly raptorial hands. You can see a particularly nice example from a Maniraptoran called Deinonychus at the top there. But there's a few groups that are really weird that I just want to touch on briefly. Very strange, unusual maniraptorans, and they're among the weirdest of dinosaurs. These claws belong to a giant Mongolian maniraptoran called therizinosaurs. This was found in the 1950s, and when it was first found, these claws were thought to belong to some kind of weird giant turtle-like monster. You can see it's given these long hand claws there. It wasn't suspected this was a dinosaur, but thanks to substantially more complete remains discovered later on, we now know in fact that this animal, Therizinosaurus, it belongs to a whole group called the therizinosaurs, a group of maniraptoran, coelurosaurian, theropod dinosaurs. They've got small teeth with leaf-shaped crowns, and they've got a toothless beak. These are not predators. These are plant eaters of some sort. Their body shape is very unusual. They've got a comparatively short tail. They've got really broad hips. And they seem, unlike the vast majority of dinosaurs, to have walked with a kind of inclined, a diagonal body posture. That's not typical for dinosaurs. Indeed, it's not typical for animals. Animals typically walk with the body parallel to the ground. For a long time, we kind of imagined that therizinosaurs look like this. This is a painting by Lewis Ray, and it depicts a kind of crazy, kind of zebra Eddie Scissorhands kind of dinosaur. This was the sort of view we were thinking of for a time. But now that we know that therizinosaurs are maniraptorans, I've already shown you that maniraptorans are part of this major group where everything is fuzzy and feathery. We should expect these things to be fuzzy and or feathery. Again, this has been confirmed. We now have fossils of a Chinese animal called Behaviour. It's an early therizinosaur. It's covered in fuzz. There's long spine-like structures present in among a dense coat of kind of quilly, fuzzy stuff all over the place. So in life, these animals would have looked more like this. Now, I took the skeletal reconstruction of a therizinosaur and just applied the correct amount of feathering and fuzz on it, and you end up with that. This is an illustration by my colleague John Conway, and his point is that if you imagine a therizinosaur doing any one of the things it did, like for example sitting back on its haunches and feeding up from a tree, you actually lose a lot of the anatomical detail that you see in the skeleton. This looks kind of like a fuzzy haystack kind of creature. And this is a theme that's quite a thing we talk about a lot in dinosaur reconstructions. Artists have always liked it when you can see all the joints and you see the outlines of all the, see the outlines of the body and the outlines of the limbs. That's kind of what artists want to show. But if you look at living animals, look at birds, look at fuzzy mammals, the amount of soft tissue, the stuff on the outside, obscures most of the anatomy. You often don't see the stuff you kind of think you should. And artists are having to change the way they depict animals. They're paying more and more attention to this. Here's a reconstruction by Mark Whitten. Some of you will notice that his Therizinosaurus is a displaying male. The female, she doesn't really care, she's not that interested. But it's a bit pigeony. I think he was looking at pigeons when he did that. I'll just wrap up by saying that, well, there's loads of other weird groups of maniraptorans. Oviraptorosaurs, these weird parrot-headed herbivores. Again, that's the sort of image I grew up with. Looks like one of the things, one of the aliens from the V, the TV series. Any of you remember that? Showing your age if you do. But again, fuzzy ones, feathery, sorry, the original V, not the one from the WZ. Diana, so different. Oviraptorosaurs, feathers all over the place. So, no, they didn't look like the aliens from V. They look like kind of turkey pheasant things, fully fuzzy. We've got a lot of information on the biology and behaviour of this particular group of maniraptorans, Oviraptorosaurs, because we have specimens preserved, sat on top of egg-filled nests. This is Big Mama. She is an It is an Oviraptorosaur sat on top of a nest with its limbs curled around the eggs. The head and neck have been eroded by the action of wind. It was always thought to be a female, but it's not. It's a male. We can tell this by looking at the cross-sectional details of the bone. We look for a special tissue called medullary tissue, which is generated by females when they're growing eggshell. This animal doesn't have any medullary bone, and that's not because it's a female that's just used her medullary bone. You can actually tell that it's an individual that hasn't been reworking, it hasn't been modifying the inside texture of its bone. So this is a male, and we now wonder if male parental care of nests was kind of quite a common thing in non-bird dinosaurs, as it is in some living birds, particularly in birds that are close to the origin of birds, ostriches, emus, kiwis. In those, it's the males that do a lot of the chick and egg care. In some Oviraptorosaur nests, there are the remains of other dinosaurs. This is the partial skull of a small predatory maniraptoran called Tyrannosaurus, and it's found in the same nest as one of these Oviraptorosaurs. We don't know why it got there, how it got there. One possibility is that it was a piece of food brought in by a parent and dumped in the nest for the chicks to eat. Another one is that it was a predator looking out, looking after itself, running around, and it went in the nest to scavenge and got killed or died there. And another one, perhaps the most intriguing possibility, is that it's actually a cuckoo. It's a cuckoo dinosaur, and that it sneaks into, it was laid in the Oviraptorosaur's nest. And any one of those is possible. And cuckoldry is not unique to cuckoos. It's all over the place in birds. Loads of birds do the cuckoo thing. Even there are pheasants and ducks and loads of things that do it. So Oviraptorosaurs and therizinosaurs, those two weird maniraptoran groups, they seem to be plant eaters. If we look at another one of these family trees, we think of maniraptorans as predatory because we think of Velociraptor and Deinonychus and so on. But the fact that herbivory is quite common in maniraptorans, shown by these green blocks here, actually suggests that herbivory or omnivory was the normal thing for maniraptorans, and that the predatory ones, your velociraptors and kin, they actually evolved from herbivorous ancestors. So the group of theropods that includes birds may have been mostly herbivorous or omnivorous. Only a few lineages within that group were predatory. That's an interesting thing that we've only just discovered. Dromaeosaurs, this group that includes Deinonychus and Velociraptor. Again, here's a classic depiction. This is by an artist called John Sibbick. This, I think, is still on display at the Natural History Museum in London, this painting. Again, classic scaly skin stuff. I was always confused by this painting. I always figured that this one, going back to the cuckoo theme, this Deinonychus was raised by Tyrannosaurus, the big herbivore, as kind of a cuckoo, and it's walking along one day and it sees one of its brothers or sisters being attacked by these horrible predators. So it's attacking to defeat this predator, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but or maybe they're meant to be ganging up and killing it together. I don't know. But again, the fossils show that you should imagine these animals as these kind of fully feathered land hawk type creatures. Fuzz on the skull, all the way down to the tip of the snout. They do not have the naked scaly face that you see in old reconstructions. Again, feathers all over the place on the arm, giving them wing-like structures. They're famous for having these giant switchblade-like claws on their second toes, and the conventional thinking was that they would run up to other dinosaurs and disembowel them, kick open the belly, and the guts would spill out onto the floor, which seems to be an unusual way to kill things. It's not how predators today normally behave. So a team of researchers, led by Phil Manning, they built a robot dinosaur leg, fitted it with a sickle claw, and they got it to try and rip into the tissue of a selection of animals, and it basically never worked. It never worked right. As soon as the claw got into the tissue, it would jam. It wouldn't slice. It just couldn't slice through the tissue. There are some problems with the way their model worked, but let's not worry about that. The basic principle, they showed that you cannot just slice through tissue. You cannot just go up to an animal, kick it, and its guts will fall down to the ground. So what's been proposed more recently is that these large sickle claws on the second toes were more likely used for pinning prey to the ground. This is consistent with the fact that the dinosaurs that have got this giant raised claw on the second toe, they actually have very short, stocky lower limbs. So maybe they're grabbing onto things with their feet, balancing on top of it, piercing into it, pinning it to the ground with the large sickle claw, and then they're eating it. They're not killing it and then eating it. I'm afraid animals tend not to do that kind of thing. They tend to eat something until it dies. And that is how modern predatory birds, this is a sparrowhawk, or maybe a goshawk, it's an accipiter hawk with a magpie. This is how these hawks kill. They have an enlarged second toe claw. They do the same thing. They pin it, they remain attached to it, they mantle, they have their wings open, they maintain their balance on top of it, and it struggles for a time, and then they start eating out its liver and its brain, and then it dies. We have one really spectacular fossil that may show an instance of this. This is two dinosaurs locked together. It's called the fighting dinosaurs. It's a velociraptor and a protoceratops locked in combat. And the protoceratops is, I think this is an event that went badly wrong for both these animals. Probably went more wrong for the velociraptor than the protoceratops, because the protoceratops is a big, hefty beast with a sharp, powerful beak. And if you look at these photographs, the velociraptor is grabbing hold of the side of the protoceratops' face with one of its hands, but its other hand, its other arm, okay, that and that are velociraptor arm bones. That is the upper jaw of the protoceratops. That is the lower jaw of the protoceratops. The protoceratops is actually biting onto the velociraptor's arm. Plus, the protoceratops is kind of like on top of the velociraptor. This velociraptor is not having a good day. This did not end well. They died either when a sand dune collapsed on top of them, or when they were buried by a sandstorm. But how relevant this is to the predation side I've just been discussing, we're really not sure. The enlarged sickle claw on the foot of the velociraptor is pushed up against the side of the neck in the protoceratops. I think this is an incident that was like a completely bodged attempt at predation. I said that some of these small feathery dinosaurs have got particularly elaborate plumage. Now, Microraptor is another member of this group, the Velociraptor group, and we've got several specimens that have got beautifully preserved long forelimb and hindlimb feathers. So they don't just have wing-like structures on the forelimbs, they've got what look like wings on the hind limbs as well. Are they using these structures to glide or to flap with? It doesn't look likely that they were running around on the ground that much. I mean, they can run around on the ground, we think, but maybe they are mostly clambering around and doing a little bit of gliding and fluttering and stuff. So a huge number of papers, I think it's going on for 10 technical papers now. Different teams of researchers have built models or computer simulations, or they've made life-size ones and put them in wind tunnels. They've done all these things to try and investigate the aerodynamics, the flight behaviour of Microraptor. At the University of Southampton, we've got several wind tunnels. So we constructed a Microraptor, called it Morris for some reason, and we stuck real feathers on it, and they're anatomically accurate. And one of the debates we have about these particular dinosaurs is how flexible their hind limbs were. Whether, if they were to jump out of a tree and glide, whether the hind limbs had to be in a straight downwards posture, or whether they could actually sprawl the hind limbs out to the side. Because dinosaurs don't seem to have been great at this. They don't seem to have been great at sprawling out to the side. The limbs mostly constrained to being directly underneath the body. So we tested various different hind limb configurations. We basically concluded this animal is kind of like a tremendously inefficient, clumsy glider, but it's good enough. It's good enough for you to think that it's a dinosaur that's doing a little bit of everything. It's doing a little bit of running around on the ground, a little bit of clambering around on branches, a little bit of gliding, a little bit of fluttering. With the legs down, it performs much better. It glides much further, which is good, because that's the configuration that we expected to see. And the idea that this is a generalist animal doing a little bit of everything, this is confirmed by what we know about what it was actually eating. We've got some specimens that have got fish in their stomach contents. Now, there aren't many fish up in the trees, so this tends to show that it was doing stuff in the trees but doing stuff on the ground as well. From proto-flappers, gliders, animals like that, they are close to the origin of birds, and of course modern birds are, in many ways, the weirdest of dinosaurs. I mean, hummingbirds and swifts, whoa, they're just crazy. I mean, sword-billed hummingbirds, swifts, oh, really strange creatures. But if you look at birds in general, I mean, I hope I've kind of emphasised to you enough times, there is lots of dinosaurian things in the anatomy of birds, but the more of these bird-like non-birds we find, the more we realise how bird-like they were. Velociraptor and oviraptors and all those non-bird dinosaurs, incredibly bird-like. If you were to go back in time and see a selection of these animals, you would not be able to point to that one and say, that's the bird, that's the one that's going to survive and give rise to 10,000 species in 66 million years' time, because they all looked really samey. If you watch fighting chickens, I'm not saying it if you watch hummingbirds, but if you watch fighting chickens or peacocks, come on, they're dinosaurs, there's no doubt about it. So you know those small flying dinosaurs you see all over the place? I think some people call them birds. This view promoted still in Hollywood, Jurassic World, no, these dinosaurs did not look like this. They were these fuzzy, fully feathery things. That's a plug for, I'm not going to talk about that. I sell t-shirts, I don't know why I put that in there. But books, I do sell a selection of books. I only have a couple of copies of Walking with Dinosaurs, The Evidence here. I'm selling them for $5, just get rid of them. And I've just had a new book come out this week, which isn't on dinosaurs. It's called Hunting Monsters, and it's on cryptozoology, something else I've got a technical scientific interest in. Don't worry, it doesn't mean I believe in Bigfoot or anything. And if you're interested in any of the stuff I've covered today, I do blog at Tetrapod Zoology, which is currently hosted at Scientific American. There's a recent article about crows, and I've also written about extinct crocodiles and giant future bats and monitor lizards and such. So I think that wraps it up. I'm sorry I went somewhat over time. I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Darren. Absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure. I think I'd like to hear it again sort of next week, just so I can sort of recap on all that information. Absolutely fascinating. We obviously do have plenty of time for questions, so I think, have we got someone who's got a roving mic to hand around? Oh, thank you, Simon, as usual. Okay, so if you've got any questions, you can only speak when you hold the mic, but if you wouldn't mind taking a few. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello. I'm just interested in, I'm a complete numpty when it comes to dinosaurs, because I actually up until today thought they all were these scaly big things. I do apologise about that. I'm a physicist, so I don't really know about these things. But I'm very interested therefore as to where you actually draw the line. You're saying non-bird-like, bird-like. It seems to me they're all bird-like.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So
as soon as we have enough fossils, it's inevitable, given the fact of evolution, that you will end up with shades of grey. So where you draw the line is completely arbitrary. And at the moment, we kind of agree that we're going to keep the name birds for that one lineage that includes Archaeopteryx and the living birds. That's kind of our convention. You've got to use the lineage that includes living birds and probably Archaeopteryx for historical reasons. The reason we kind of go with these particular, let's only call this group birds, let's only call this group dinosaurs, it's like what has been most useful in the literature. People have always, there's no point in coming up with a new definition now, because that means you create endless complication as goes how you understand the older literature. So let's stick with the understanding the name birds goes to that lineage. The complication then, if you're talking about Archaeopteryx, Archaeopteryx has always been a bird, we've always regarded it as one, is what if it's actually not? There are a bunch of studies which find Archaeopteryx to be on other branches close to birds. And what do we do then? Does that mean we should pretend that Archaeopteryx doesn't have to be a bird and we should only keep the name for the lineage that includes living birds? Or do we expand what we mean by the term birds? Does it now mean that Velociraptor and Oviraptor and those things are they birds? My point is, I know that's a bit all over the place, sorry, but my point is we have a convention where we decide we're going to stick it to that lineage. So long as you're talking about the lineage that includes living birds, it wouldn't be useful in terms of our understanding to say that now Velociraptor in relative to birds and Oviraptor and kin of birds. It would be most useful to keep it to that lineage. So as a community we make a decision. And it is completely subjective. Completely subjective. But that is inevitable given the fact that evolution is a continuum. Where are you going to draw these lines?
Jack?
Right. Wonderful, Darren. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oops, sorry. I want to talk to you about Carl Schuker. He did a PhD with me a long time ago.
No, I know Carl very well.
Yes. But what I want to talk about now is the question of definition. Defining something is something in a mind. What we're doing here, surely, is describing. We're not defining. And that difference is absolutely crucial for your beautiful way of describing birds and dinosaurs. They are described as being like this and this and this. And you talk about Fuzz, which I worry about, because I think feathers aren't fuzz.
Well, for a vernacular audience.
Yes, that's all right. Yes, I see your point. but you mustn't try, I think, to define what is a bird, and you don't, but you describe what is a bird, which is a much nicer trick. Our physicist friend here would like, I think, to define a bird or a reptile. And, well, I've been rude about physicists a lot of times. I say they know about matter, and they know about energy, and because everything is matter and energy, they know about everything. But they've forgotten they don't know about and. You take the point.
I think I take the point. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. We must be careful in a discussion of this kind to not. This is in effect deep philosophy in terms of the difference between definition and
a description.
Yes, I do take your point, and I think it's useful to a degree. I think it's useful to describe animals, organisms, fossils in terms of broad. I mean, me saying that something is bird-like, everyone understands. That means it's in some way akin to the living animals that go by that name. But I mean, you do have the fact that we do have to have definitions in terms of what I was talking about, which names we attach to which parts of the tree. There is a need sometimes to say that specifically the name, think of all the technical names I've used, specifically Maniraptora or Theropod specifically has to be defined, as us understanding it goes only to that particular lineage. But that's different from what you're getting at. And I also think that the kind of archetypal constructs that we often have in mind when we're talking about how we describe prehistoric animals, we mustn't fall into the trap of using of employing typological constructs. This is one of the greatest obstacles there has been to our understanding of dinosaurs. The fact that dinosaurs are reptiles because they are within this group of organisms that we call reptiles. There's somewhere within that group that includes crocodiles, lizards, and crocs, and crocodiles, lizards, and turtles. But because we have a set of attributes that we associate with the term reptile, typological constructs, there's this typological idea that if it's a reptile, well, therefore it must be scaly-skinned, it must be cold-blooded, and that is something that our improving knowledge of the history of evolution has basically taught us to not be tricked by that. That is the way of folly, to think that a label is attached to a set of constructs, because things are, well, the more I learn, the more I think that the natural world is a mess. And yes, there are laws, I know there are physics, I mean, I'm sure you could talk a lot about the things that are facts, they are unchangeable laws, but in terms of evolution and the gradations, the continua that exist between groups of organisms, it's so untidy, and it becomes more messy and more tangled the more we understand. I mean, the fact that we now know that there are lineages of organisms that have separated and then come back together through hybridization. I mean, you just cannot understand that in terms of the tidy trees I was talking about. So all these trees I've shown you, they are schematic representations, the most simple explanations we can depict. But life isn't a tree, it's a web. You've got things coming back together and multiple hybridization events, and so, yeah. You can have a whole conference on what you mean by these terms, so thank you for that, yeah, I agree. So yes, I agree.
My question was just, I suppose I never really thought about it properly, but I always assumed that, is it on? Is it on?
Yeah.
I always assumed that feathers were the result of the need for flight. Evolved from flying. But that doesn't seem to be the case from what you're saying.
That's right, that's not
so
the case.
at some stage, you've got these furry animals that possibly have feathers, and obviously we're not covering feathers. So why, mammals, why are they hairy and these animals are furry? Feathery. What do you know? Is there a reason for that? Do we know the difference? Or actually, are feathers closely related to hair? Completely different.
That's like 6 questions you've managed to pack in. So it was always thought that, given that for a long time we only had feathers associated with birds and very bird-like animals like Archaeopteryx, it was thought that they evolved within the context of flight. that is not the case, given that, from what we understand, the shape of the family tree and all these other groups in which we have feathers, no, feathers evolved earlier in non-flighty things. We think at the moment, that's what we think right now. As to why true feathers evolved, I mean, we think at the moment that the structures that I've been referring to in a kind of, loose off-handed way, fuzz, filaments, it seems those structures are homologous, they're of the same developmental and evolutionary origin as true feathers. It seems that these filamentous things evolved first, but how you got from that to complex feathers at the moment is one of the big unknowns. And this is quite a common theme in studies of evolution. We know that a thing happened, we know that humans became fully bipedal, we know that brains became larger, blah blah blah, so many other examples of that, but we often don't really know why, and you aren't probably ever really going to know why without time travel. So why complex feathers evolved, it doesn't seem it is a flight related thing. Now I'm quite partial to the idea that complex feathers probably initially evolved in association with display. This is hinted at by the fact that the complex feathers in some of these non-bird dinosaurs, the complex feathers first appear on the forelimbs and the end of the tail, which, I'm not going to make a fool of myself too much, but you can imagine these animals, kind of waving their tails and all these kind of things that you see in living birds. Plus, we now have evidence that there are colours and patterns involved. They're the sort of structures you expect. They look like the sorts of pointlessly complex things where sexual selection pressures associated with the advantage they provide in terms of passing on genes, they look like complex structures of that sort, given that you can't find a better explanation for them. So that may be like a good working model for the origin of true feathers. But as for the prototype structures, the filaments, the hair-like things, well, the fact that we see, so what's present in birds and all these other dinosaurs, that's not relevant to the history of fur in mammals. These are obviously independent evolutionary events. And we see hair-like structures evolving in many different lineages. I mean, there are loads, insects, bristles and fuzz and fur all over the place in insects. So they did probably evolve within the context of temperature regulation, retaining heat. So I think that more or less covers your general gist.
That's good, yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. A couple of questions here. Firstly, you mentioned at the end about this sort of generalist dinosaur, a bit of gliding, a bit of walking around. I just wondered if, I can sort of see the benefits of being able to glide, but I wondered if the benefits of being able to glide might be outweighed by the costs, or might be outweighed by the costs of being on the ground. It strikes me as it'd be quite heavy, perhaps, and clumsy on the ground. So I wonder if the benefits of being able to glide to escape a predator or to grab a predator might be outweighed by the risks of being on the ground, with the sort of heavy feathers, perhaps. And the other thing I wondered is going back to the forearms. You mentioned that you think they might be used for grabbing.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you had any idea about how strong the force was of that grab. And secondly, I just wondered if, again, it just strikes me that if they're leaning forward to grab, can they do that without falling over?
Okay.
Just wondered what your thoughts were on those.
Right. So the first thing about disadvantage as goes being on the ground.
Yeah.
Remember, the animals we're talking about are not as big as a crow. These really are very small animals. So, sorry, we're having a bit of a malfunction with the podium. No, it's fine. So, what we understand of the way the feathers are distributed in those animals is, so Microraptor is this famous one with the long feathers coming off the hind limbs. An early idea was that, well, surely this thing has got to be spending all its time in trees because it's going to be really clumsy on the ground. But no, the way the feathers are actually oriented on the hind limb, the way in which they are directed, they are not like these fan-footed pigeons or chickens, which have got, their feathers become really messy and they dig into the ground. The feathers actually project backwards, enough for us to think they probably can scamper around on the ground. And I mean, can't give you a hard answer on that because we don't know enough about these animals, we don't know enough about what they were doing. But I certainly can see from the shape of their claws, the anatomy of their limbs, the overall size of the animal, they're able to run around on the ground enough to be okay. But they're living in environments with predators that are 5 times the size of them and 10 times the size of them, so they probably are mostly spending their time avoiding bigger predators, so it probably is in their advantage to be clambering around at height. I have been involved with other people, we've done some claw curvature studies on these animals, and we find that they best match with generalist percher climber type living animals, which is consistent with what I was thinking about them being generalised. So you asked also about the force involved in hand grabbing. Somebody could at some point do some actual studies on the way the musculature might function and the force the animal might be able to impart on an object, but nobody has as yet. I'm sure someone will do it in time. We're at a very early stage of people using computer modelling to work out, you know, strength and all this kind of stuff in fossil animals. There's a lot of that work has only just really started. Nobody's done it yet, but as a ballpark, I mean, their muscles they're not super muscular, but they're muscular enough for you to think that they can do a clap and a grab and hold a little struggling mammal or a smaller relative of theirs. Microraptor doesn't just have fish in its stomach contents, it has small birds in its stomach contents as well. So we think that if you imagine, as what I said, the feathers coming off the second finger and the back of the hand, even the ones with the full wing on the full feathering on the forelimbs can still grab things, maybe clutch things hand to hand, maybe clutch things to chest, that's been suggested. But in terms of the actual numbers, no, there's nothing to give you there yet. But and you asked the third thing, and I've forgotten what that was.
Strikes me if you look at like the traditional bit of a T-Rex and so on.
But if it was
topple
to grab,
yeah,
would it topple over?
Yeah. So good point, and often mentioned in reconstructions. Reconstructions often make theropods in particular look top heavy. Really interesting thing about these dinosaurs is, now I mentioned really on, I showed the picture of a skeleton of a duck and I said it was filled with blue latex, and I mentioned the pneumatic system, but I forgot that I don't actually elaborate on that in this talk. Dinosaurs of this kind, not all dinosaurs, but theropods and sauropods and their relatives, they are heavily pneumatic. They've got giant air sacs connected to the lungs, and they've got air-filled sacs distributed throughout the skeleton. They're much lighter than we would assume based on what you expect for animals of a similar size. A giant sauropod, say Diplodocus, is actually 10% lighter than it should be once you take account of all the pneumaticity that it's got in it. Everything about their respiratory system is utterly different from we mammals. And what this means in terms of how their body mass is distributed is theropods are actually really light up front. Even a thing like Tyrannosaurus, most of its head is air, its vertebrae are all filled by air, there are these giant air sacs distributed in the chest. So really light up front. The back end, on the other hand, there's a gigantic muscle, the cauda longus, there are various other big muscles attaching the hind limb to the tail. These dinosaurs are very, very heavy at the back, and I think that explains how they could adopt this teeter-totter, that's the wrong word, isn't it? What do I mean? Seesaw. They could adopt this this seesaw-like thing where they're okay, they're well balanced at the back, but they're not heavy at the front. And there is some maths behind that, has been worked out exactly where the centre of gravity is, and centre of mass.
Thank you. The mic's over there. We'll take over there.
What attributes did help this group of creatures to survive, you know, when the climatic change? Was it their size and their mobility? That's one of the things I can think of.
There's a whole bunch of things that you could propose enable them to. Given the birds of theropods have been around for 220 million years with approximately the same body plan. So whatever they're doing, they're very good at it. And you'd think they might be constrained by the fact that they're bipedal animals that are doing, you know, first of all grabbing and later on locomoting with the hind limbs. But their ability to run fast, to adapt to all kinds of prey. I mean, you've got lineages that are doing everything from being arch predators grabbing other big animals to those that are omnivores and strict herbivores. They seem to have been very flexible behaviourally, biologically. So yeah, they don't. I mean, the big event, obviously the extinction event 66 million years ago, it does seem there's a size filter, and if you're a big animal you're going to die out. If you're small you'll make it through, and at this particular time in history, the very end of the late Cretaceous, the only small dinosaurs were birds. If other kinds of dinosaurs had made it through, maybe there would be dynasties of dinosaurs that weren't birds beyond the end of Cretaceous, but there weren't. Birds are the only ones that made it through because of body size, made it through that event. So I would say size was a factor in the extinction of many lineages, but prior to that time, they just seem to have been hyper-adaptable, extremely ecologically flexible, able to exploit all kinds of resources. And while many are specialised, many are not, many are generalised.
Was there another question over there? Or okay, right, with regard to the filaments, I was just wondering whether there had been any physical analysis, molecular analysis or anything like that to support or otherwise your cladistic diagrams.
Yes, there has been. Feathers are constructed of a type of keratin known as beta keratin. So whereas most of our integumentary structures are formed of alpha keratin. So when these feathers and feather-like structures were initially published, there was this claim from some corners, are you sure those are really homologous? They're developmentally the same as the feathers as feathers, as true feathers. And yes, those studies have been done and they have been shown to be chemically homologous to living feathers. So I think it's more complicated than that, because the way feathers themselves are formed is not simple. They're not just beta keratin, they do have some alpha keratin, but filaments and feathers that have been analysed on these animals, yeah, they are homologous with the structures of birds, and they're microscopically identical as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Oh, another question.
I grew up being told that dinosaurs were reptiles and cold-blooded. When did you come to the realisation that probably wasn't true?
That's a good question. Well, like I said, I'm a child of the 70s, so I actually grew up just as this, what we call the dinosaur renaissance, was happening. It happened in the dinosaur renaissance, if you're American, the late 1960s and early to mid 1970s was a time at which a number of researchers, particularly in the United States, John Oster, Robert Backer and a couple of others, they were saying that, hold on, if all the anatomical evidence that we've got pertaining to dinosaurs, what we understand about their trackways and how they behave, the fact that it seems birds are deeply nested within this group indicates that these animals are reptiles. They are part of the major group of organisms that includes, like I said, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, turtles and such, but they are more reptiles that are, I don't want to start talking about typological constructs again, becomes complicated. You shouldn't think of reptile as necessarily meaning cold-blooded, scaly creature. I understand that's the common kind of, that's the sort of lay use of the term, but in a scientific use of the term, reptile now applies to this group of organisms that all come from a common ancestor. So dinosaurs, including birds, are within this group called reptilia, but it doesn't mean they are all cold-blooded and scaly. I mean, the definition, the understanding of the metabolic status of dinosaurs is still argued about, still intensively argued about. But a lot of the evidence we have pertaining to growth rates of dinosaurs, the size of the blood vessel foramina on their bones, the size of their organs, all these kinds of things, suggests that many and probably most and maybe all dinosaurs did have an elevated metabolism of some kind. It doesn't mean that they were running at kind of like, hummingbird kind of level, but they weren't necessarily relying on external sources of heat, which is what you associate with reptiles. But with what you associate with the animals you conventionally call reptiles. But then, in keeping with what I was saying about everything being messy, I mean, it's not true that reptiles, in the conventional sense, as in cold-blooded, scaly things, it's not true that all of those are cold-blooded, slow metabolic things anyway. I mean, we know of several lizards that are able to generate and retain heat internally. There are several turtles that retain heat and have an elevated body temperature. And of course we know of mammals and birds that rely mostly on external sources of heat and have relatively low body temperature that fluctuates with the surroundings. So the metabolic status of different animal groups is complex, but you should be thinking of non-bird dinosaurs as bird-like. And this is the thing that started in the late 1960s. It's called the Dinosaur Renaissance. And I guess I grew up at the time this was kicking off. And, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Darren. That was also absolutely fascinating, wasn't it? So can you join me again in thanking Darren very much? Oh, is there a little question?
Just the future.
Hang on.
I've read that there's going to be a thing built at Portland, which is a big dinosaur sort of park, but it's also going to be educational. It's something like the Eden Project, and it does have those directors, you know, that are raising the money. So it's in the frame, and I just wondered, is that something you could become involved in? Because looking at the pictures that they're going to build, we're going to have the old-fashioned dinosaurs in there.
Really?
Yes. Everybody else
down there.
It was all in the Echo and everything. They are building.
Don't believe what's in there. Along the south coast here we have a fantastic many places yielding many important fossils. Dorset coast, obviously, the Jurassic coast. I'm sure we all know about that. There is only one dinosaur. Well, there's only 2 or 3 non-bird fossil dinosaurs that come from the Dorset coast. Scythe-clawed, the armoured one in particular. Most of the other animals are ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, these marine things. But what's the name of this project?
Jurassica.
Jurassica. Thank you very much.
The director of the project died this week. So
Really?
Yes.
The director died this week.
yes, there's some doubt about it because the director of the project has just died.
Oh, okay. Some doubts about it because the director just died. I know it's got support by David Attenborough. I do know some of the people involved, so maybe I'll ask some questions. But I would be disappointed and shocked if they went for old school dinosaurs. If it wasn't the Echo, it might just have been a journalistic mock-up though, and they tend to like recycling file stuff from 1955 or whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Mentioning David Attenborough, Darren is involved in David Attenborough's 90th birthday celebrations and is going to be working with the great man himself.
Was Tyrannosaur correct in the programme on Tyrannosaur?
It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all.
It was pretty close
pretty
to correct.
Good. Yeah, it was alright.
Good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, everybody. So join me in thanking Darren very much for an absolutely fascinating article.